Sometimes when I suggest that there are people who might abuse, say, government, I get a response of skepticism and even a label of conspiracy theorist. However, I think history is a solid argument for the fact that there are always people seeking to conquer, to control other human beings for their own gain, and thus it makes sense to always operate with a strategy of caution to prevent people from abusing others. From conquerors like Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan to more recent ones like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, we see that there have always been people who will do whatever it takes to have power. However, it is not always by military force, and in this day and age, the games one must play to conquer are much more complicated. Let's look at some of the ways people conquer. Hitler conquered by military power, but he had to affect the culture of Germany as part of his rise to power and his ability to guide people. I don't know whether it was a conscious tactic or came naturally out of his personality, but Hitler used the power of disgust to move citizens. He compared the Jewish people to rats and vermin, and he removed their humanity in other people's minds. Really, he preyed on a psychological element we all have, which is disgust. And by this simple manipulation spread via propaganda, millions of Jews were murdered. Stalin fueled much of his revolution using Marxist class ideology, the theory that certain classes of people as a whole oppressed other classes of people, and that they could have collective guilt simply by being part of a classification of people, was spread first in the Russian colleges until it was popular enough that people wanted the government to act on it. Rich people, Christians, and really anyone Stalin felt like, were put into the gulags, basically concentration camps. It was argued that criminals were only criminals because rich landowners owned much of the land. So to promote justice and equality, the criminals were put in charge of the gulags. The criminals slaughtered many of the prisoners there, and likely many more people were killed than were even killed in the Holocaust. You should note that Hitler preyed on the tendencies of right-leaning psychology, and Stalin appealed to the tendencies of left-leaning psychology. However, as I defined earlier. However, my main point in summing up these bits of history is to show that, when available, people will lie and manipulate so that others will willingly consent to the desires of those with dehumanizing intentions. Niccolo Machiavelli was an Italian politician, among other things, in the early 1500s who wrote a book called The Prince that was a guide to attaining power at all costs. In it, Machiavelli says, "Never attain to win by force what can be won by deception." Part of the strategy of effective conquerors is to suffer minimal losses, manipulating people into handing over the things they hold dear of their own free will is always the best option for them when possible. On the other hand, these examples of government corruption and abuse are not the only issues we need to be concerned about. There are many corporations, as there have been for a long time, who also abuse people wherever they can, just like political conquerors. In the 1700s, Russian Orthodox monks were coming to Alaska to preach Christianity to the natives. At the same time, the Russian-Alaskan Trading Company was working in the fur trade in the area, and they often abused the native workers in many ways, such as not paying them their promised wages and even sexually abusing them. The monks tried to oppose this corruption, writing letters back to Russia reporting what they were witnessing, so the company did its best to spread lies about the monks, including forging negative journals about them to try and hurt their reputation. Today, banana workers in Ecuador are being taken advantage of by corporations like Dole, Chiquita, and Del Monte. The companies are paying the workers less than the price the bananas should cost because they know no one else will buy them, and the companies are reporting on their taxes that they are paying full price. They are using child laborers and forcing their employees of all ages to spray harmful pesticides that are killing the workers. While in America, we are blessed with the opportunity to quit a corrupt job and go elsewhere, The employment needed to support their families is not as common, and much of the work is the same work selling to the same companies. These are mostly random examples that I've learned about in the last couple years. However, this is happening everywhere and across history, just as much as evils like those of Hitler and Stalin. Companies like Monsanto are partaking in similarly abusive practices right here in the US today. I would also argue that because there has never been as free of a country for business operation as America, we have far less examples of what super organizations look like when they go wrong. But I think we are just finding out. Anti-socialists seem to fear corrupt government. And anti-socialists seem to fear corrupt business, and anti-capitalists seem to fear corrupt government. But I think what is particularly important is noticing that when one goes corrupt, they bring the other one with it. When Hitler rose to power politically, he used that power to take over the banks, and as he conquered new areas, he forced the businesses in those areas to sell resources to him at extremely low prices. Many of the worst forms of government oppression have involved taking over schools, which is how the Hitler Youth were formed, based on a Prussian schooling model designed to keep soldiers loyal by absolute control. On the other hand, George Soros is an important influencer in today's world and a powerful example. He's a businessman, but he destroys economies and influences governments for his own benefit. Here's a couple of quotes from a 60 Minutes interview that's been removed from YouTube many times, but people keep re-uploading. Soros says in it, "I am there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do. I am one person who at one time engages in a moral activity and the rest of the time tries to be moral. I don't feel guilty because I'm engaged in an immoral activity that doesn't have anything to do with guilt." Conquering and abusing through government and business are not the only ways to abuse people for one's own benefit either. We have pimps who perform human trafficking here in the United States, cult leaders and even pastors who sexually and emotionally abuse those within their reach, and individual people who abuse their significant others and children. For Christians, this is even less shocking, though just as sad, knowing that humans are prone to selfishness and sin. This knowledge of oppression and the need for people to stand up against it is a fundamental part of captivating stories, necessitating there be an antagonist, usually some sort of villain or supervillain. My point here is that there should be absolutely no doubt that there are people actively seeking to take power for their own ends at the cost of the well-being of other people. Thus, whether in business or government or churches or any other social interaction, especially where power is an option, we must be wise and wary. Even when power is created by those with the best of intentions, it draws the predatory, like the cries of a wounded animal. Much of the hard work for these kinds of people has already been done when we create these large vacuums of power. This is what is so important about having the power in our country divided up, rather than giving it all to the federal government. And I think this is what conservatives seem to naturally understand and teach well. There's a specific tactic that I personally believe is being used right now in the United States. It seems to me that the political parties have become businesses that mainly work to guarantee their members' jobs. The way they function, with money paid even after a person is no longer an elected official, seems to be blatantly the opposite of the title, public servant. I think the citizens subscribing to the parties are even being pitted against each other to distract us from what's going on in the background and in order to maximize their profits. The legendary Chinese general Sun Tzu, who lived 500 years before Christ, offers tactical advice in his book, The Art of War, that is relevant to the topic at hand. Sun Tzu is the originator of the phrase, divide and conquer, a key part to winning any battle. And he notes that chaos hides order and strategy. He also notes that converting the enemy and their resources, rather than destroying them, counts as 2 victories, because an enemy is lost and an ally is gained. Most importantly, Sun Tzu emphasizes that knowing the enemy is key. He notes that a general should discover the enemy's dispositions while hiding his own, and should rush to the point on the battlefield where the enemy has least ability to defend. Sun Tzu summarizes these tactics by saying, "The opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself." I think many of our politicians on federal, state, counties, and city levels, and other people we don't see in the spotlight, do exactly this. They sell a brand and product to the people who they know will buy it. This product is simply political promises. I also suspect that some of the products we are being sold are actually designed to antagonize others and feed on our need to fulfill our confirmation bias in order to increase the ever-widening political gap. War is profitable, and the war between political parties seems to be a different kind of military-industrial complex. I also think many politicians know exactly who they are trying to compete with, and thus work to specifically offer what the other group has had a hard time offering, or at least has a reputation or image projected that they have a hard time offering, whether now or in the past. Those selling to the left, who I wouldn't consider genuinely left, have focused in on topics like race and sexuality, not because they actually care, but because the right historically has struggled to support people in those areas. So those who lean to the right really do need the help of those who lean towards the left with issues like social justice. As I noted at the beginning of my speech, Hillary Clinton is documented on video changing her stance on homosexuality every few years. Likewise, George W. Bush said all the right things to convince conservatives to support him, and then he helped pass the ability to spy on US citizens with the Patriot Act, which violates fundamental values of conservatives. This pragmatic value system, taking on policies not because you believe them, but because they will get you elected, is not a partisan issue, which means we need help from the other side to identify this corruption. One of the rules in Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, is to pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Ernest Hemingway said, and let this sink in, "Being against evil does not make you good." We need to remind ourselves of this every time someone says exactly what we want to hear. One of the things that most convinced me of the insincerity of both political parties was following Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders. Ron Paul was gentle and respectful, while the polls in the news kept saying his chances were low. Unwinnable was the word they used. Yet not only did most conservatives I know support him, many of my staunchly left friends in Portland said even they would vote for him. They liked him. But he wasn't doing so great in the polls, and that was their only reason that they wouldn't vote for him, because they didn't want to waste their vote. So the polls controlled people's vote. On the other hand was Bernie Sanders, whose policies I honestly think would enable some dangerous powers for government, but who I deeply respect as a person because I think Sanders has sincerely tried to do what he genuinely thinks is best. The Democratic Party didn't let him near the candidacy. And if you want to see something scary, look up videos online of what the Democratic Party did to Bernie's supporters at their convention. The DNC tried a variety of nasty tactics to block them out, including white noise machines, turning the lighting off over their assigned seating area, and then having other people hold up green squares so you couldn't see the signs of the Bernie supporters in the audience. This is all on video. I honestly believe that if you have sincerity about the values of either political party, you aren't allowed anywhere near certain positions by the party themselves. I believe the people in power only want those elected who will play nice. You'll notice I've been saying left and right, liberal and conservative, but I've said little about Democrats and Republicans. One other subject I want to briefly discuss in regards to Conquerors is how they can prey on us psychologically, especially as it ties to the intuitive subconscious I was discussing earlier. These are important in every level, not just in looking for people manipulating us, but also in our own everyday function as human beings. As we already discussed, we are often looking to confirm our own biases. What can happen is that they are magnified by being fed information about the other side, further driving us from listening and further enraging us to fight. And I don't mean like good dialogue type fighting, I mean literal fighting some of the time. We also are susceptible to the power of bias via repetition. But this doesn't necessarily mean from outside sources and people I would call conquerors. Simply by clustering together by labels, we'll reinforce our blindness through social echo chambers. We must intentionally facilitate diverse encounters with genuine friendship in mind amongst people with other political viewpoints. There's also a psychological phenomenon known as priming, which is when a stimulus prepares us to respond a certain way even before we understand what we've encountered. So we don't understand, but we're already responding. For example, many conservatives, if asked, will point out that they very much do value the environment. Yet I have seen so many conservatives react harshly at anyone or anything using the word green in regards to environmental friendliness. While I do acknowledge that there can be agendas behind this and other words, there are many sincere people who have the same concerns as us who use these sorts of words. And our reactions prevent them from giving our views a chance. We still have to give people and their ideas a fair shake, even if we've seen something abused or misused. As I often say, you can't let the way a truth is abused cause you to turn from truth. All that has happened then is that you've accepted coercion into a lie. A classic Chinese proverb says, one cannot refuse to eat just because there is a fear of getting choked. In the last study I want to mention, subjects were shown a statement by a political candidate that agreed with their views. Then they were shown a statement from the same candidate that contradicted the initial statement. And finally, they were shown an explanation of how the two statements were compatible and not actually contradictory at all. What researchers found was that while the person was listening to the second challenging statement, the person's brain reacted as if they were being tortured. This actually makes a lot of sense with our earlier discussion of cognitive dissonance, the tension of trying to hold two contradictory beliefs. What researchers also found was that when the explanation, the third part, of the seeming contradiction was read, the subject received a tiny release of dopamine, which is the same pleasurable chemical released, for example, with the ingestion of cocaine. As Jonathan Haidt notes, extreme partisanship may be literally addictive. Whether it's over-posting political articles on Facebook or screaming about hate in people's faces with megaphones, or being that one relative that always has to bring up politics at every family get-together, these may be cases of at least mild addiction. From my encounters with both political sides, I think they each have a different word for what are two sides of the same coin. Those on the right discuss the value of liberty, and those on the left look to fight oppression. Having heard both sides talk about these two values extensively, I would sum up in my own words that both sides are looking to protect the dignity of human beings. While many of us might disagree on where this value of human dignity comes from, be that God or society or elsewhere, it seems a large majority of human beings are intensely interested in seeing people, animals, and nature treated well. Acknowledging the potential for abuse from oppressive government, oppressive business, and otherwise, I think there is a strategy that works very well to prevent widespread atrocities, massacres, and human degradation. The Founding Fathers understood it when they developed the state system, dividing up power, and I am also happy to say I see the same attitude in Portland, even if for different reasons. My personal word for this philosophy is localism, the idea of focusing both our political solutions and our business choices into the local sphere. Ideally, we vote for politicians and which ones have power with the ballot box, but we also vote for which businesses have power with our wallets. I'm not against federal government, nor large businesses, but I would encourage people to vote with ballot box and wallet for an emphasis on local businesses, government, and community first and foremost. I think you'd be surprised how excited Portlanders would be to hear that, and also the Founding Fathers. When you follow a prioritization of local to its logical end, it finds its foundation at the individual. One of the subjects I've learned about from my left-leaning and social justice friends is called intersectionality. It is the idea that not only do specific groups of people have unique experiences different from those of other groups, but the experiences of a person in multiple groups, such as a black woman, is different than the sum of its parts, being black and being a woman. A person in Africa and a person who has red hair won't have many of the stories that a person with red hair living in Africa will have. This is intersectionality. However, Jordan Peterson notes that there are so many groups and no objective way to decide which one should be the most important measurement, be it by race, gender identity, hair color, attractiveness, height, etc., that as soon as you pick one, you've minimized another. Peterson argues, and I would agree, that true intersectionality points to the unique experiences of every individual. Thus, we come back to the idea that the individual person's experiences and choices need to be the building block of our culture. Peterson notes the individual is the ultimate minority. I consider the acknowledging of the value and unique experiences of people groups to be incredibly important, but not at the cost of the uniqueness of each human being. Based on my personal experiences of what I have learned from each group, I want to give a particular example for each side of something unique I have learned from them that I think is fundamentally important to human dignity. Many of the conservatives and right-leaning people I know place an emphasis on liberty, and they understand how the Constitution was actually an incredibly wise way to preserve liberty so that no particular people could oppress through government power. I think many moving left would actually be positively interested in the value of the Constitution for social justice if they understood it and were given quality historical examples. But it is being taught about less in schools today, and it's being blamed for a lot of our problems. And I think a lot of times conservatives don't know how to teach it to these particular people. However, Martin Luther King Jr. attributed the civil rights he rightly sought to the Constitution when he said in his famous speech, "In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white, would be guaranteed to the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." During the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, the left was much more aware of government abuse. But these days, the right seems to have much more awareness of this form of abuse and are the sources I have had to go to research it happening in the US today. They know government oppression and they know its history, be it socialist or fascist or any other flavor you prefer. Understanding the psychology of people who tend to lean conservative, this makes sense, as those on the right are often sensitive to their personal responsibility, their freedom, being taken away. However, I want to point out what I feel many conservatives have neglected and what I have learned from my left-leaning friends. I would sum it up as social justice. I used to dislike this phrase until I understood what justice actually meant, which is to align things as they rightly should be. Western culture has made justice a very legal term, and sadly it lies in part with Western Christianity. While modern justice has to do with paying costs for legal infringements, the early Christian church saw justice not as a right alignment of debts to a legal code, but a right alignment of our hearts to Christ's love. Thus, God's justice played out as his transformation of us, meaning that if consequences positively transformed us, he allowed them. And if mercy would transform us, then he would choose mercy. Where this applies to social justice is that its proponents seek to have society be rightly aligned to a form that respects people's dignity as human beings. Being strong in compassion and sensitive to people's unique circumstances, they want to promote the stories of those they encounter who have not been acknowledged in their suffering. They are also keenly aware of how hard it is to understand someone when we have not had their experience ourselves, which is what they mean by the word privilege. Christians might call it being blessed. We all know how easy it is to quickly glance over deaths in the news, while the death of a family member is grueling. Much of the left is comprised of people who are trying to help others overcome this issue. They are also passionate about the variety they desire being socially tolerable. And when they feel the desire is being infringed upon with others telling them what is proper, they react similarly to the right when the right feels government is oppressing them. What I see happening is a sad and spiraling pattern between these two groups that both seem to completely misunderstand because they haven't done the work to understand the other side. In my personal analysis, there is no person to blame as starting it all, but I will start with the right, who historically have been more rigid in their social expectations due to a stronger sensitivity to threat and change. Those on the left, who tend to be neurologically inclined to seeing variety of experience as valuable, have pushed back. Additionally, the American dream of being rich and successful in a nice suburban home has left the right with a greater ignorance of the suffering of certain individuals and groups. I am not criticizing this occurrence, but it is happening as a natural byproduct of prosperity. Left-leaning people, being high in openness, have found themselves compelled to try and help those in America not part of this comfortable lifestyle, regardless of the cause. Not being listened to as much as they would like by what has been the established culture, many on the left realized they could use government to force what they genuinely believed needed to be done. I think others, who again are not truly left or high in openness, have realized they could sell a solution through government to these people for their own gain, and have pushed in every curriculum they can that anyone who won't go as far as possible to promote social justice doesn't care about the left's concerns at all. Now many see forcing their social justice through government regulation as the only solution, and the right is terrified because they see their own equally valid concerns of government oppression being disregarded. Of course, the fear on the right has been equally cashed in on by others wanting to profit from political office. Worse, each side has less and less understanding of the other, and at this point sees only the worst parts of the other side in the news. So they make up straw men for why the other side does what it does. The toxic far left seems to have made a religion out of projecting motives onto people, such as controlling women's bodies through abortion and labeling any question of their projection as hate, reminiscent of fundamentalist Christian circles where any detection of doubt is called a sin. Brainwashing begins where permission to question ends. If I proposed a rough model of what a compromise might look like, it would be the left learning more from the right about the history of oppression from government and why the 50 states and dual federalist model of government protect against some of the worst kinds of massacre. And it would also be the right learning from the left about social justice and experiences outside of their own, and also where businesses can go wrong. That's just my initial proposition to get people thinking about possibilities, though. I know there's people on both sides who will think that what I just said is absolutely not enough, and the other side is completely wrong. But I'm looking to my many friends and everyday people I have met in Spokane and Portland and elsewhere who are concerned about politics. I believe they'll see there is something to this, and I dare to believe they have a lot in common and can find genuinely satisfying compromises and genuinely satisfying friendships. One of my friends, who is a feminist and a passionate member of the LGBT community, came to visit me here in Spokane. She does construction work and and my dad was looking for help. So I had her come with me to help on some projects. I was worried at first because she's definitely not a traditional female in personality or in appearance, and she knew my dad was conservative. But within 5 minutes of the meeting, I felt like a third wheel because they were getting along so well. While there's a lot people may disagree on politically, I think if we actually had chances to encounter other people with the belief that they're valued simply by being human, and maybe even have something to teach us, we might actually get along and we might even learn something. Demonizing them guarantees we won't be able to see if they are truly right or wrong anyways, because we'll have already decided in advance. We'll see what we've already concluded is true, whether it is or not. If we allow outside sources to tell us what is truly important and to convince us that anyone with a different view is an uneducated fool with nothing to teach us, we'll continue in our current patterns of electing officials to undo the policies of the last official, who undid the policies of the last official we elected. Sun Tzu said that exactly this would happen if we understand ourselves but not the enemy. He said we'll face a loss for every victory. That seems to be the current American political situation in a nutshell.